A few weeks ago, Sound Particles released a new delay plugin called InDelay. This plugin supports immersive audio formats up to the Hamasaki layout of 22.2, or for those more interested in ambisonics, up to 6th order ambisonics. However, don't click away if immersive audio isn't your focus. InDelay is equally interesting for regular stereo production. In fact, that's how we're going to test this plugin today in a stereo session using Ableton Live. So let's get started. In a recent video, I pointed out that there aren't really a lot of immersive delay plugins on the market today. I recently reviewed Lumina Delay from Mountain Road DSP, which I liked a lot. And a couple of months ago, I made a video about the excellent Audio Brewers Astrometry Delay, which works in the ambisonic space. And then there is the Cargo Cult's Slapper 3 plugin, which is excellent but excessively expensive. And apart from that, you will find a few ambisonics delay plugins, but that's pretty much it. So InDelay is positioned in a space that doesn't have a lot of competition, and it adds a few features that no other plugin offers and that we are going to check out today. Before I open up Ableton, a quick disclaimer. Sound Particles had reached out to me shortly before the release of InDelay and provided me with a free license of the plugin. Now, at that time, I had just finished recording all my videos for my vacation break, so this review today comes a little late. However, everything that I'm going to say today is strictly my own opinion and nobody had any influence on this review. And with that being said, let's jump into Ableton. I'm working with a Mac today, but everything that I'm going to do works completely identical on Windows. So if you're on Windows, don't worry. I'm just using a Mac because I find it more convenient. Now, here I have an Ableton session, which is super simple. All I really have is a kick. So let me just kind of play that so that we know what we are dealing with. And I think this is more than enough to just demonstrate the capabilities of InDelay. Now, I've already added an instance of InDelay to my track. Let's just open that. Now, as soon as you open up InDelay, you're prompted with the user interface, which is both very organized, but also a little bit challenging because you need to understand what's happening here. Now, first of all, on the very top, we have a couple of buttons that allow us to set the input settings and the output settings. So here in the input, we can select what input signal we have. Now, obviously, we're working with Ableton, so we have a stereo input, but we can select anything that the DAW supports up to Sony's 360 Real Audio, which is actually really interesting. I might make a video about that because that is one of the few plugins that actually can work with Sony 360. But as you can see, you can do almost anything, including the Hamasaki layout, the IMAX layout, the Aura layouts, and all of the Dolby Atmos layouts. So that's actually very convenient. Now, if you select a certain input setting, you will see the input channels here on the left. Once again, currently I only have a stereo input, and that essentially means I only see the left and the right channel here. Then I have the output settings, and on the output settings I have a couple of options for the stereo signal. I can kind of decode it in regular stereo. I can use vector-based amplitude panning. That should be the standard really, and there are a couple of other options as well. I can choose binaural if you want to, and I can also choose all of those layouts. And what I find particularly interesting is that InDelay allows you to choose those layouts even though we are working with a stereo DAW. Now, it will actually internally process that in multi-channel, but in Ableton in particular, you cannot use all of the channels. You can only use the first two. There might be DAWs that actually can take advantage of that. I'm not completely sure, but Ableton can't. Now, depending on what output format you choose, the visualization here of the three-dimensional space is going to look different. Currently, I see these little dots here that represent my left and right speakers. But if I, for example, choose a different layout, so for example 5.0, then I see essentially these 5 dots here. There's one here in the center that I'm currently have kind of covered by the 2 handles here. So I have these 5 speaker positions, and if I go to higher layouts, obviously, for example 9.1.4, I see the different speaker positions here as well. And if I go to something like, for example, ambisonics, first order ambisonics, I see the entire sphere. Now, the way to read this here is that this is sort of the top-down view of a semisphere. And that's actually going to become a bit of an issue because at least I was not able to select anything that is below the listener position. In this view, I could only select things that are above the listener position. I'm going to come back to that. That might not be an issue depending on how you're going to use in delay. Now let's go back to our vector-based amplitude panning stereo setup. Once again, that should be the standard if you're working with stereo. And let's have a look at the other things that we can do here. Where first of all, we have the presets that we can select. I'm not going to work with those, but you can kind of check out what different people have done with InDelay and kind of simply kind of use that as a starting point. There's a randomize button, and the randomized buttons in sound particles plugins usually work really, really well. So you might kind of have fun kind of just randomizing things here. Now then we have here on the top, we have the three main options that we have. We can work with the plugin channel-based, we can work with it tabs-based, and we can work with it with particles. And this is actually the really unique feature of this plugin because it allows you to, on one hand, work in a channel-based version or in a channel-based kind of workflow, or in the other way also in a completely 3D workflow with particles. And that's actually something that only this plugin can do. And once again, we're going to kind of go through each of those in order to see what they do. But once again, that's actually really unique. So let's stay with the channel-based workflow for a moment. Now, in the channel-based workflow, we have these three windows here. On the right side, we have the output window. Here we see the output channels. We see the gain for the dry signal, the gain for the wet signal, and obviously we can change that to anything that we want. And we also have a master gain here that allows us to kind of adjust the overall gain of what comes out of InDelay. Here on the bottom, we have the time view that kind of shows us where the tab currently is and how the individual tabs are distributed in time. And we can actually work with that, so we can actually move that around, and we can even kind of change feedback settings and also gain settings by kind of just working with this little kind of handles here, and that's actually really convenient. So if you want to have fine tuning, and if you want to see exactly what the plugin is doing, you can work with those directly, or you can also simply use the dials here. So we have the feedback dial, the gain dial, and then the time. And on the time, we can either sync the plugin to the DAW, or we can use the delay in milliseconds. So if we set it to sync, for example, we can select it to be like a quarter or kind of something else, whatever we want. Now, one thing that I find a little unfortunate is that this sync setting is a global setting. So if you change that in one channel, it's also automatically changed in the other channels. So you cannot, for example, have the sync setting on some channels on and on some channels off. You cannot mix and match. You have to either sync or not sync. So if I turned it off here on the left channel, it's also turned off on the right channel. And that's true also for the tab section that also has this sync button here, also for the individual tabs. So each tab essentially needs to follow the same sync settings, which once again is a little unfortunate. I would like to see the plugin being able to essentially kind of mix and match. So that should be something that the plugin should be able to do. And quite honestly, that's probably easy to implement. So if Sound Particles sees that, I would assume that in one of the future releases, this is going to be implemented. At least that's my assumptions. We can link the channels. So if we want to kind of have the same for all channels, we can do that here, or we can treat the channels individually. And most importantly, we have here in the center the handles. These handles allow us to configure the positions of the individual tabs. And as I said before, the way to read this is that you are looking at the top of a semisphere, and these handles are kind of moving around on that semisphere. So if I'm moving that into the center, I actually have it on top of me, and if I move it to the side, I have it on the left side, and so forth. Once again, unfortunately, I didn't find a way to actually move that below the listener, which once again for Channel-based layouts isn't an issue because you usually don't have channels below the listener position, but in Ambisonics it actually is, because in Ambisonics you would like to be able to have tabs below you as well. I was not able to do that, so maybe somebody knows how to do that. Leave me a comment in the comment section. I was not able to do that. Now let's kind of look a little bit closer to the individual tab settings. Essentially what we have here is that we have a classic delay where we have individual kind of instances where the sound is played back. But what we can do is we can actually, and for that maybe just kind of let me turn on, let's reset everything for a second, and let's turn on the audio, and let's most importantly also turn on the plugin. So let's put the bad signal, let's do that a little quieter. So what you can do here is in the feedback settings, so you can change the feedback here. So let me go to sync mode. I can, if I want to, that's kind of on the left. Let me put that in the center. Now what you can do here is you can, for example, if I want to have only 4 tabs, I can go here from classic to 4. And that will then allow me to set 4 tabs. And these tabs can be anywhere in the 3-dimensional space. Move that back to the center, and let's maybe turn the right one completely off. There are a couple of different ways on how you can work with those tabs. So we can have 1 tab, 2 tabs, 3 tabs, 4 tabs. We can put certain repetitions. So for example, if we want to go through all 4 of them and then restart with the first one, so we can do that here by 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. That essentially means it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then repeats everything. And that's actually really, really convenient. We also have a tab option here, and that tab option allows me to kind of select the timing based on tabs. So I can tap here, and then essentially it will kind of choose the tempo accordingly. Now we do have a couple of, and let's maybe kind of set that back to classic. We do have a couple of options in terms of how we are going to move that in space. So we can select, for example, that these tabs are going to rotate. And we can change the speed. We can select it to be random. We can select it to go up and down. And once again, this up and down was really the only way I could figure out how to actually move a tab below the listener position, because if you're choosing up and down, it actually goes below. So the plugin is technically possible to have tabs below the listener position. I just didn't find a way to kind of set that for the static tabs. Or we can have them float here around here somewhere. And there are different kind of parameters that we have. We can choose increase the area, we can increase the speed. And if we have more than 1 tab, we can do that essentially as well. So if we want to rotate, for example, all of these tabs are now rotating simultaneously. So we don't have individual control over each tab, but essentially kind of we can kind of rotate them all together. Now, if you want to have a tab, and let me go back to the classic settings. So if you want to have, and maybe to static, If we want to have the tab in one speaker position, what we have to do is we have to hold the shift key, and if we move the handle, then essentially it will snap into the speaker position. So if I want to have it in exactly the left speaker, I can do that by dragging this handle and then essentially holding the shift key. And it will kind of snap that tab into the speaker position. And once again, I can either kind of control everything through these knobs, or I can also go down here and kind of control it here, which is really nice. So the user interface is actually quite astonishingly good. The only grievance that I have is sort of this semi-sphere, which might be a little bit difficult to understand if you are not really comfortable with working in 3D. Now, all Sound Particles plugins have sort of this type of interface. So if you're working with Sound Particles, if you have other Sound Particles plugins, you're probably comfortable and you probably know exactly how everything works. So much to the channels. Let's go over to the tab section. Now in the tabs function pretty much the same way. The main difference is that we are not kind of defining everything by means of the channels. We are defining everything through individual tabs. And we have a total of 16 tabs available that we can turn on or off. And we can move them around in exactly the same way we moved around the individual channels. So the difference between the channels and the tabs are more or less that in the channel-based version, essentially each channel becomes a tab, so to speak. Otherwise, things are very similar. We can select which channels are going into each tab. So for example, we can have one tab for the left channel, one tab for the right channel, or we can also select that both channels go into one tab. And or if you have multi-channel, obviously you can do that for each individual channel. And then everything else is pretty much exactly the same. We have a sync button, a tempo control, a gain control, a feedback control. We can once again select between the classic mode or kind of a mode where we have up to four iterations, and then we can kind of cycle through them in certain ways. And we have the modifiers. We have the tab that we can select, and we have the timing. So let's just start it again. So let's maybe kind of increase the feedback. Let's do it here. Let's go back. Let's turn off the second tab. Let's just work with one tab for a second. And once again, we can do exactly what we did before, kind of working with multiple kind of instances and having that positioned in different spaces, and we can choose how they are going to be repeated. We once again have the possibility to rotate. And if you have more than one kind of instance, once again, we essentially rotate all four of them simultaneously. We can change the speed. We can have that random. We can have, once again, them up and down, and they always kind of move together, or we can also have them float. And we can increase the area and do all kinds of crazy things with it. So let's go back to the classic mode and maybe to static, and let's move that back to the front position. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about in the channel section is this additional section here, that is the filter section. So let's kind of have a look here in the tab section to the filters. What we can do is we can add additional filters, and they're currently providing 4 filters. There is a 3-band EQ filter where we essentially can change the low, the mid, or the high frequencies. So if you want to have more high frequencies, oopsie, that's a little much. We can do that. We can reduce the low if we want to. We have a parametric filter where we can select the frequency, the gain, the Q. Oopsie, that's a bit much. We have something that they call craziness. I'm honestly not completely sure what exactly that is, but it does sound a little crazy. Let's put the delay. Let's put the delay back to 0. to play around with it. The manual doesn't really specify exactly what it is, but it does something, and that's quite interesting. And then we have an air button where we can essentially increase the air. I'm not quite sure if that's something that can be heard here, especially through YouTube. Probably not. And if everything goes too crazy, we have a kill button that essentially kills everything and kind of restarts everything in case that's necessary. Now, while this filter section is nice, there are a couple of things that I'm actually going to be a little bit complaining about. The first thing is that this is really a little limiting. While there are 4 very nice options, one thing, for example, you can only choose one. You cannot, for example, have craziness and air simultaneously. That's not working. You can either have parametric, freeband, craziness, or air, or none. In the parametric section, we only have one thing that we can change, which is also not particularly good. And the thing that I'm actually most missing is a high pass and a low pass filter. I'm not quite sure about you, but I actually use those a lot if I want to make sure that the taps of a kick, for example, are not interfering at the low end. So I usually kind of have a high pass filter on my delays, and this does not provide that, curiously. There's actually no particular reason why they didn't include that. Maybe it's going to be included in a future update. I'm desperately missing that. I really would like to see a high pass filter, a low pass filter, a band filter here. But that's not an option, and ideally we would like to kind of have multiple filters kind of simultaneously here. But that's really, honestly, my main complaint. I'm going to kind of have a kind of summary at the end, and I'm actually going to complain there about that as well. Now, these are the 2 channel-based options, really, or more or less kind of channel and tab-based, but they're pretty much work in the same way. The one thing that works completely differently is the particles section, and that's something that Sound Particles is known for, obviously, because it's in the name of the company, Sound Particles. And here what you have is you can work with particles. So instead of working with tabs, you actually have particles that move around in 3-dimensional space. If you've ever worked with any Sound Particles plugin, you know what I'm talking about. It essentially allows you to do all kinds of crazy things. Now, the one thing that I will say is that working with particles, it takes a little bit getting used to. There is a bit of a learning curve because it can get crazy very, very quickly. So let's just kind of play around with that for a second, and let's see if we get anything that actually makes sense. So let's play our sound again. As you can hear, let me just kind of turn that. So there are 2 different options here for the distribution of those, and we can actually kind of move them in space here a little. The time divergence. Now, it allows you to select, well, once again, there are 2 different options. I forgot to mention that. There's sort of the linear distribution of those sound particles, and then there's a Gaussian distribution. Now, there are different. You can select the number of particles that you want to have. So in this particular case, I have 10, and that's already pretty crazy. So if I increase that, it gets out of hand very, very quickly. So usually if you're working with that, you probably kind of are at the low end. Then here you have a regular button where you can change different kind of types of how these particles are distributed. Here they are distributed vertically, horizontally, and so forth, or regular. You can change the attenuation according to distance. You do have a sync button again, but here actually the sync button makes sense because all the particles have to kind of act in the very, very same way. So the fact that we have only a global sync is fine in this particular case. And we can once again change the individual kind of settings here, the gain, the difference between the gain, or the divergence of the gain of the time. And as I said before, you can also do that here in the time slider here. And as with the other options, you also have here movement modifiers. You can rotate the particles. You can have them move randomly. So let's go to one of the soundscape options, for example. So that's moving that here. Okay. So let's go back to regular. You can do that up and down. We can float. Should increase the area probably. And then we obviously also have the filter section. So this is actually all pretty neat. Now the fact that it InDelay combines both these 3D approach, that is something that we'll find in AudioBrewer's astrometry delay, for example. And that once again is a little bit difficult to wrap your head around because it can get out of hand very quickly. But the fact that Sound Particles InDelay combines that approach with a traditional channel-based approach that everybody should be really comfortable with, or a tab approach, actually makes it an extremely versatile delay plugin. So actually I do like that a lot. So what's my final verdict? Well, first of all, it should be noted that immersive delay plugins usually fall into one of the two categories. On one hand, you have delay plugins that operate in a channel-based layout where you control the amount of delay that goes into each individual channel. This would be Lumina Delay from Mountain Road DSP, for example, or Slapper 3 from the Cargo Cult. People who work with traditional surround sound formats usually prefer that approach. And then there are plugins that work natively in 3D, such as AudioBrewer's Astrometry Delay or the Ambisonics Delay plugins that you will find in some Ambisonics plugin suites. Plugins that use this approach are usually preferred by people who work in Ambisonics or related immersive audio formats. The unique thing that InDelay provides is that it accommodates both approaches. So whether you prefer to work channel-based or natively in 3D, InDelay offers both, and I really like that a lot. On the negative side, there are a few omissions that I find very curious, but which Sound Particles should be able to address in a future update. First, I'd like to see the option to change the sync settings per channel or tab. At the moment, the sync settings are always global. The delay is either synced to the DAW or it is not. I think it would be good to have the option to have some channels or tabs synced while others are dialed in by time. Second, the filter section needs improvement. Currently, you can only use one filter at a time, and on top of that, the parametric filter is somewhat underwhelming. And most importantly, it is missing a low-pass filter and a high-pass filter. To be perfectly honest, the lack of a low-pass filter is probably the only thing that prevents me from making this my go-to immersive delay plugin. And third, if you're working with Ambisonics Audio, you should take note that it seems that InDelay cannot produce static tabs below the listener position. At least I was not able to achieve that, even after reading the manual and everything. It will move tabs below the listener if you select the up-down modifier, but I did not find a way to move a static tab to the lower half of the sphere. In case this is possible and I just missed it, let me know in the comment section below. This is generally not an issue for channel-based configurations that do not have a speaker position below the listener, but it might be a deciding factor for you if you're working exclusively on Ambisonics, for example. Otherwise, this is a great plugin. If you're interested in InDelay, I recommend trying it out. They have a free trial available. If you like the plugin, InDelay is priced at $199. This is a lot, but not as excessive as the $439 you have to shell out for the Cargo Cult's Slapper 3 plugin. At the moment I'm filming this, Sound Particles still offers a launch price of $148.99, which I think is really reasonable. And they also offer bundles with other plugins which might make it more worthwhile. But what are your thoughts? Let me know in the comment section below or join our free Discord community for a chat. An invite link is in the description below. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. Also check out my reviews of 2 other immersive delay plugins that each have their own unique twist. Links are here on the screen somewhere. And with that being said, see you all in the next video.